Hi, this presentation is going to look at U.S. fertility patterns. This is building off of a previous presentation that had a global focus. We can start by looking historically at the United States in the 20th century, which started off with relatively low birth rates, particularly around the time of the Depression. And that, of course, created lots of opportunities for babies that would be born during that time because the population was relatively smaller, creating less competition in the workplace, for instance. So in the 40s and 50s, the nation saw its highest birth rate ever, and that's the period referred to as the baby boom. And of course, we're not the only country that has had a baby boom. We can find a similar bump in most countries at particular points in time. And it tends to coincide with the time when the country transforms from being agricultural and rural to being more urban and industrial. Currently, within the United States, the key is looking within different subpopulations and particularly different ethnic groups where we find strikingly different patterns of fertility and, of course, of age structure. Overall, the birth rate in the United States, while holding steady over the last 20 years or so, has started a precipitous decline since perhaps the time of the Great Recession. That's a pattern that would, of course, reflect what happened around the time of the Great Depression, also lending some weight to the economic theories of fertility discussed in another presentation. This shows some of the ethnic group differences for 2011. Crude birth rate for Asian Americans, for instance, 14.5, much higher than that for European Americans, but less than for Hispanic Americans, which as a subgroup have the highest birth rates, and also the highest growth in total fertility rates. If we look across all groups, we see that the crude birth rate in 2011 for the United States is 12.7. And while the gross fertility rate is 63.2 and the total fertility rate 1894.5. This table breaks things down a little further into looking at distinct subpopulations of teenage mothers, unmarried mothers, and also patterns of low birth weight. And we can compare ethnic groups on each of these types of patterns along with total births. So if we look at teenage mothers overall, all groups combined, 2000 there was about 11.8. 2005 and 2008 are similar at about 10.2, 10.4, close numbers. If we look at African Americans, the teenage rate is about double that for the average of the country, but it is coming down. 2005, 2008 reduced by about 2. For Asian Americans, teenage birth rate is much lower. You can see it's about half that of the average of the United States, even a third more recently in the last 2 time points there. For European Americans, it's close to the average. It's the dominant group, so that's not surprising. Hispanic Americans, slightly lower than African Americans for teenage births. And Native Americans come in, at least in recent times, as the highest group, slightly lower in 2000 than African Americans. So it's a complicated story when we look across different ethnic groups. Births to unmarried mothers, we can see that has been increasing actually, perhaps as more women choose not to marry or decide later in life they want to have children. There's different reasons for that, but that's been increasing, while teenage pregnancy has been decreasing slightly. If we look at African Americans, we see that's a very high rate, very high number rather. 2068, it's gone up to 72 by 2008. Now that does not imply necessarily young mothers, but certainly overall category of mothers, unmarried, high rate for African Americans. Also for Native Americans coming in very high at 63, 65, and 57, although it's come down more for Native Americans than it has for African Americans. For Hispanic Americans, that's the third ranked group in terms of the rate of unmarried mothers, and that has had a U-shaped distribution where it went from low to high back to low. It's currently at its lowest rate for Hispanic Americans. For European Americans, currently it's a very low rate of unmarried mothers. That's an important statistic, correlates highly with economic well-being and so forth. It explains a lot of different types of social problems. So this is a critical demographic to focus on. Low birth weights, this is an indication of the health of the mother as much as the child, and also highly correlated with socioeconomic status. And there we see African Americans are suffering the worst low birth weights, followed by Native Americans, who are more closely associated with Hispanic and European Americans. Asian Americans also have a slightly higher low birth weight rate, and that's something that's an interesting research question. And that will conclude our discussion of U.S. fertility patterns. Thanks for watching.